General Elias Thorne hated the taste of the recycled air in this forward bunker. It was thin and metallic, smelling faintly of ozone and old dust, a combination that had defined the last 20 years of his life. He stood at the edge of the triage bay, the light harsh and unforgiving, painting the tired faces of the medical staff in shades of sickly green. Outside, the punishing dust storm was finally easing, the perpetual rasping sound of pulverized rock against the reinforced plasteel walls fading to a hollow murmur. Thorne knew that sound was the only real sound of this war, not the grand explosions or the rallying cries, but the slow, grinding erosion of everything worth saving. Commander Jessa Rourke stood 2 meters to his left, rigid and efficient, radiating an anxious focus that Thorne found irritating. She was young enough to still believe that victory was quantifiable, that metrics and logistics mattered more than dust and decay. Thorne felt the heavy weight of his service sidearm strapped low on his thigh, a relic energy pistol, polished but rarely drawn. It was more symbol than weapon now, a testament to 2 decades of command rather than defense. He watched the organized chaos of the med bay, where exhaustion had replaced urgency. They had captured 3 survivors from the last skirmish, Kaelin infantry, notoriously tough and strangely brittle under sustained fire. 2 were already inert on the stabilization tables, their medical status coded and filed. The 3rd lay on a low cot, a large specimen, even by their enemies' standards. His armored plates were stripped away, revealing skin the color of riverstone, slick and dark with antiseptic residue. Thorne focused on Nurse Ilara, a woman whose movements were so economical they seemed bored, cleaning a deep, ragged wound near the Kaelin's clavicle. She didn't look up. For the medics, the enemy ceased to be the enemy the moment they crossed the threshold. They became tissue, circulation, and statistics. They dealt only in the immediate present. Thorne shifted his weight, a faint scrape of his polished boot on the synthetic floor. He felt a familiar, deep ache in his own shoulder, a phantom pain that had stayed with him since the Solstice assault almost 15 years prior. Rourke's eyes flickered toward the sound, her expression a careful blankness. She was waiting for him to issue orders regarding the captives, standard interrogation protocols, transfer manifests, the machinery of attrition that kept the war running smoothly. Nurse Ilara used a high-frequency sonic scrubber to clear away the last of the clotted blood from the wound site. The Kaelin remained perfectly still, perhaps unconscious, perhaps simply stoic, enduring the vibrations that cut through the silence. As the final residue was lifted, the wound itself became visible, raw and angry, a fresh injury, the result of recent skirmishing. But it wasn't the immediate damage that seized Thorne's attention, draining the thin air from his lungs. It was the tissue beneath, surrounding and framing the fresh entry point. It was a mark he hadn't seen in 2 decades, yet recognized instantly, with a cold certainty that bypassed memory and went straight to the gut. A deep, chaotic spiderwebbing of dark, dense tissue centered ominously over the sternum, spreading outward like a fractal pattern burned permanently into the riverstone skin. Most Kaelin scars were thin, straight lines, the clean surgical results of their standard laser weaponry. This was different. This complex deformation was the specific, unforgettable signature of the phase shift disruptor, an experimental weapon they had deployed briefly, brutally, during the opening salvos of the first contact war on Proxima's moons. The disruptor had not been an efficient weapon. It often failed to kill, instead leaving the target alive but hideously scarred, the unstable energy output fusing tissue in chaotic, non-uniform patterns. The project had been scrapped quickly, classified, and eventually forgotten by everyone except the handful of high command men who had authorized its gruesome trials. Thorne was one of those men. They had called the specific scar pattern the Elias mark in the classified reports, a grim joke derived from his command endorsement on the weapon trials, a dark secret buried under decades of operational history. Thorne stared at the intricate, horrific architecture of that old wound, the silent testimony to a failure of ethics and engineering from a lifetime ago. This wasn't just a Kalan soldier pulled from the recent front lines, interchangeable and nameless. This was a veteran, perhaps one of the very first enemies he had personally failed to kill cleanly, whose body carried the physical, enduring history of Thorne's original mistake. The irony was a cold, sharp blade rotating in his gut. They had spent 20 years erasing each other, only to find the same persistent, poorly healed wounds staring back across the generational divide. The war had changed theaters, objectives, and technology, yet the damage remained immutable. The Kalan stirred slightly beneath the harsh lights, a low rattle in his throat. The heavy folds of his brow tightened, registering pain, or perhaps merely the indignity of the sterile environment. Nurse Ilara began to apply a large synthetic dermal patch, covering the new injury, but the Elias mark remained visible just above the edge of the dressing, a dark constellation of past decisions permanently etched onto living flesh. It showed the relentless efficiency of trauma. You could pour billions into developing better weapons and strategies, but the first damage done, the original sin, had a way of enduring. It persisted in the biological record of the survivor, acting as a physical contract to the cycle of violence. Thorne felt his knuckles whiten around the grip of his sidearm. It wasn't hatred he felt, or even guilt exactly. Guilt was too simple, too fleeting, something you could file away. This was the crushing weight of time, the realization that everything changes, yet the foundations of suffering remain identical. The faces change, the tactics evolve, the names of the dead are added to the roll, but the first wounds, the original cruelties of war, endure in the flesh of the survivors, proving that all the strategies and all the blood spilled since then had failed to resolve the damage done in the beginning. This was not a fresh enemy he faced. This was his own past, breathing, bleeding, and enduring. Rourke spoke, her voice low and professionally efficient, cutting through the quiet hum of the life support machines. General, the prisoner manifests require your signature. What are the immediate detention protocols for this one? Thorne didn't answer. He was looking at the nurse, Ilara, who finished the bandaging with clinical indifference. She didn't see the mark, only the injury. She was detached from the narrative, only concerned with the repair of immediate tissue. That was the luxury of the present tense, the blissful ignorance of history. His fingers relaxed slowly. The heavy, polished energy pistol slipped from his grasp. It hit the synth steel floor with a shockingly loud clank, a sound that cut through the sterile quiet of the triage bay like a hammer blow, instantly drawing every medic's attention. Rourke jumped, turning her head sharply toward the weapon. Her face, usually so composed, registered confusion, then sharp alarm. She looked at the pistol, then back at Thorne, searching for injury or madness. "Sir, your sidearm." Thorne didn't look down at the fallen weapon, didn't move to retrieve it. He felt suddenly light, stripped of the artificial weight of command and symbols. The pistol lay there, a useless piece of heavy metal against useless metal. He looked back at the scarred Kalan, at the enduring testament to his 20-year-old mistake, now being cared for by a young woman who had no idea she was bandaging history itself. "Protocol change, Commander," Thorne said, his voice rusty, quieter than he intended, forcing him to clear his throat against the dry, metallic air. "Immediate change. We will hold the interrogation protocols, secure the unit, ensure the medical staff have everything they require, unrestricted access. And Commander Rourke," he added, turning fully, meeting her confused gaze with an expression she had never seen, profound and exhausted recognition. The manifest can wait. I want a full, high-resolution scan of this individual's physiological history, every scar, every prior trauma, every surgical correction. I want to know exactly how long he's been fighting and where those original wounds came from. Rourke hesitated, clearly formulating a sharp, practical objection about resource allocation and security risks. But Thorne's look stilled her. It wasn't a request. It was an acknowledgement of a debt long overdue. She simply nodded, bending quickly to retrieve his sidearm, holding it carefully as if it were contaminated by the floor. Thorne stepped away from the glare of the triage light, retreating back into the shadows where the stale air tasted less metallic, less like failure. He understood then that the great tragedy of war wasn't simply the spectacular waste of lives, but the sheer frustrating persistence of the damage. You could authorize 100 battles, invent 1,000 new ways to kill, but you couldn't erase the first wound you inflicted. It simply waits 20 years, crosses enemy lines as a survivor, and arrives on your triage cot, demanding recognition. The silence that followed the sharp clank of the dropped gun was heavy, filled only with the faint, steady hiss of the Kalen's supplemental oxygen supply. That sound, the relentless rhythm of breathing in a universe designed for suffocation, was the only persistent, unquantifiable victory either side had ever truly achieved. Thorne's sudden retreat into the shadows did not relieve the tension, it solidified it. Commander Rourke retrieved the heavy energy pistol, the metal faintly warm against her palm, and secured it in her own hip holster, his symbol of command now carried by his subordinate. The medical team, having witnessed the shocking clank and the subsequent protocol change, worked faster, quieter, anxious, under the general's unusual gaze. Thorne didn't wait for the detailed scan Rourke was coordinating. He moved immediately to the temporary analysis station set up just behind the folding privacy screen, a cramped space smelling sharply of recycled toner and chemical disinfectant. He accessed the bunker's limited database, his fingers moving stiffly over the console, searching for the original phase shift disruptor trials, the ultra-classified files linked to the Elias mark. This was his first attempt to manage the recognition, to quantify his past failure by surrounding it with data. The system responded slowly, grinding under the demand for deep archival data. He saw the visual icon flash, Access Restricted, Level Omega, referencing General Directive 7A. He knew that restriction was his own doing, put in place 20 years ago to bury the proof so deep it could never surface. He bypassed the security protocols easily, but the process was not instantaneous. The delay was enough to allow the institutional inertia to fight back. He managed to retrieve only the preliminary deployment logs, a terse list of unit names and vague casualty estimates, but no specific individual Kalen identification. He was trapped between the past he had classified and the present reality of the bleeding survivor. He had demanded answers, but the system he built was refusing to yield them. The waiting was a physical agony. Thorne rested his forehead against the cool synth steel edge of the analysis station, breathing deeply of the dry, metallic air. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He sought clarity. For 2 decades, he had justified the war as a terrible but necessary calculation to preserve their world. But seeing the Elias mark, his mark, on that enemy's chest shattered the sterile calculation. It made the war feel recursive, a slow, self-inflicted wound that never closed. He remembered the brief, terrible pride he felt signing off on the disruptor program, believing in its destructive efficiency as a deterrent. That memory now tasted like the grit from the perpetual dust storm. Culpa wasn't a military concept, but it was a physiological reality. The speaker unit above the analysis station hissed, interrupting the silence. General Thorne, report immediately to the secure channel. High Sector Marshal Kendall is initiating a direct review. Kendall, The name itself felt like dry paperwork and budget cuts. Kendall was the pure, mathematical embodiment of the Central Command apparatus, a logistics god who treated soldiers as data points and war as resource management. When the holographic projection shimmered into existence, Kendall's face was sharp, angular, and devoid of the bunker's grime and fatigue. He wore the clean whites of Deep Sector Command, contrasting starkly with Thorne's dust-stained fatigues. General Thorne, Kendall's voice was precisely modulated, carrying zero resonance of the dust outside. Your field report on the Kalen capture is unconventional. Specifically, the immediate suspension of detention protocols and the demand for a maximum-tier physiological scan on a standard infantry subject. Please clarify this operational detour. Thorne looked past the marshal, his focus remaining on the triage bay where Nurse Ilara was monitoring the Kalen's vitals. Marshal, this specific prisoner carries evidence of highly classified experimental weaponry used during the Proxima engagement. The details of his prior injury are essential to understanding Kalen technological advancement and regenerative endurance. It was a practiced, cold half-truth, the only defense the marshal would recognize or accept. Kendall's smile was thin, professional, and chillingly empty. It contained no empathy, only metrics. That program was decommissioned, Thorne. History, not threat assessment, requires this review. Furthermore, the data flow indicates that the prisoner manifest, the one required for all resource allocation and sector security clearance, is still pending your signature. You are holding vital resources, medical supplies, staff time, secure holding space, on a historical anomaly. Kendall paused, and the sterile air crackled with implied threat. I am issuing an immediate override of the scan request. You will process the detainee under Standard Class Delta interrogation protocols, effective immediately. Failure to comply constitutes insubordination under Wartime Statute 44B. Now, General. The order hit Thorne hard, a cold reminder that the bureaucracy of war was far more resistant than any enemy firepower. His attempt to quietly investigate his guilt had become a direct command challenge. The system didn't want the history examined. It wanted the present consumed, cleaned, and filed away. Acknowledged, Marshal, Thorne lied, his voice flat, his jaw tight. He watched Kendall's hologram dissolve into a shimmering wall of static. Before the network purge could fully execute the override and kill the data request, a small, unsecured packet flickered across Thorne's screen, a fragmented result from Rourke's initial attempt to run the physiometric scan. It wasn't the full history, only an estimated biometric age calculation for the Kalen, filtered through standard regenerative correction data. Approximate biological age minus standard corrective implants, 78 Earth cycles. 78. Thorne was 62. The Kalen wasn't just a veteran of the First Contact War, he was a survivor who had carried that Elias mark for almost 20 years, through decades of fighting, regenerative cycles, and grueling campaigns. The sheer, punishing longevity of the enemy was a silent, profound indictment of the war's strategic futility. Thorne stood up, the silence of the command post ringing with the truth of the number. The Kalen hadn't been fighting against them for 20 years. He had been enduring them for 20 years. He turned, seeking Commander Rourke to counter the new order, but found Nurse Ilara instead, exiting the triage bay and peeling off her biogloves. She stopped short, seeing the intensity in his eyes, an intensity far beyond operational stress. Nurse Ilara, Thorne began, lowering his voice until it was almost a conspiratorial whisper. The prisoner is now subject to extreme security protocols. Kendall's override means any further medical care will be considered resource waste, and the interrogation will be aggressive. He needs continuous, advanced medical attention. I need him moved to the Level 4 isolation unit. Immediately. Ilara stared back, her practical indifference wavering slightly. Level 4 was the high-security psychiatric holding, generally reserved for catastrophic neurofailures or subjects deemed too politically valuable to risk losing. General, that unit is designed for long-term sequestration. It has specialized filtration and extremely limited access. It requires 3 layers of authorization and a signed Level 6 manifest. I am your authorization, Thorne stated, his voice a low, heavy rumble. He placed a hand on the cool metal frame of the triage entrance, bridging the professional distance. Tell me, nurse, did you notice anything about his internal metrics? Anything that contradicts the standard Kalen endurance profile? Ilara hesitated, looking down at the discarded, blood-stained gloves in her hand. His metabolic rate is dangerously high, General. He's running on pure adrenaline and scar tissue, and his vitals stabilize only when the supplemental oxygen is set to maximum capacity. If the life support fails for even 60 seconds, she trailed off, the implicit meaning clear. The Kalen was not strong. He was clinging to life by a thread of stubborn, ancient will. Then ensure the life support doesn't fail, nurse, Thorne commanded. I need you to personally oversee the transfer and the setup. Do not delegate this. Trust no manifest, no order, unless it comes directly and verbally from me, not even Rourke. She nodded, her expression changing from clinical detachment to something akin to quiet conspiracy. She recognized the scent of deep sector trouble, the kind that involved cover-ups rather than casualties. Thorne watched her turn toward the supply depot, her movements now imbued with a deliberate urgency. He started toward the Level 4 security console, ready to face the system's bureaucratic backlash and activate his new, unauthorized detention protocols. But as he passed the original triage cot, he saw that Nurse Ilara hadn't just gathered the necessary fresh bandages and oxygen tubes. She had returned to retrieve the small, stained bundle of synthetic cloth they had used to clean the Kalen's injury, the piece carrying the Riverstone blood and antiseptic residue. She didn't discard it in the bio-waste. Instead, she folded it neatly and tucked it into a deep pocket of her medical tunic, a quiet, almost ritualistic action that spoke volumes of personalized care that went far beyond mere statistics. Thorne paused, watching the gesture. It wasn't just him fighting the system now. He had found an unexpected, silent accomplice focused on the preservation of a life. And as he saw the blood-stained cloth vanish, the bitter realization struck him with the force of a focused energy blast. Kendall hadn't just canceled his scan request. The Marshal had already sent a routine field cipher for remote systems diagnostics, a signal that, in the wrong hands, was often used as a silent, untraceable precursor for a fatal accident in high-value, inconvenient holding cells. Thorne had spent so long looking backward at his historical mistake, he had missed the immediate, mortal threat closing in on the present. The Kalen wasn't just a memory of the past. He was a live wire, and Kendall was about to cut the power to silence him forever. The metallic taste of failure intensified in Thorne's mouth. He slammed his fist, not on the main console, too risky, but on the adjacent analysis station. The dent was negligible, but the sharp, dull pain in his knuckles was a necessary anchor. He had seen the cipher, a remote execution code embedded in a standard diagnostics loop designed to mimic systemic failure and ensure the Kalen died quietly under the false flag of life support malfunction. He knew the signature, Kendall's work, cold, surgical, untraceable. Thorne dropped back into the command console, bypassing the lock Rourke had likely placed. He worked with the speed of pure adrenaline, his 62 years dissolving under the immediate pressure. His objective was surgical: isolate the diagnostics channel, find the embedded code, and purge the sequence. The air in the command post felt thin, vibrating with the silent countdown he knew was running. He found the loop in 30 seconds, a masterpiece of bureaucratic lethality. The code wasn't stored on the bunker's local drive. It was streaming, encrypted, and automated through the central command network. It was designed so that the local system could not edit, only execute. Thorne tried to override the command priority, inserting a general's full access code, the highest tier available locally. Access denied. He tried to flood the channel with junk data to disrupt the stream. The firewall, another piece of his own 20-year-old security architecture, recognized the pattern and stabilized itself instantly. The system was fighting back efficiently. He leaned close to the screen, his breath fogging the synth steel. He could practically hear Kendall's thin, professional voice. History, not threat assessment, Thorne. His final digital attempt was a localized power shunt, a brute force injection designed to burn out the receiving end of the communications array. It was reckless, risking the entire sector's communications, but it was his last resort to stop the remote kill. He executed the sequence. Instead of the expected network collapse, a single message flashed across the console, red text against the black display. Protocol breach detected. Initiating lockdown sequence 7A. General Thorne, your unauthorized access attempt has been logged by High Sector Command. The shunt had failed to burn the channel. It had merely announced his position and confirmed his insubordination. Kendall hadn't just secured the cipher. He had layered the defense with active countermeasures, anticipating Thorne's exact move. Thorne felt a deep, sickening lurch, not guilt, but the profound humiliation of being strategically outmaneuvered by the very system he had created to protect. He tore away from the analysis station. The automated, metallic voice of the bunker security system boomed into the sudden silence. Warning: Sector 7 Delta lockdown initiated. All non-essential personnel retreat to holding areas. Command personnel report to designated defense stations. Thorne didn't need the announcement. The sharp transition from the usual low hum to the blaring electronic warning meant only one thing. Kendall wasn't waiting. The accident was imminent, and the lockdown was designed to prevent anyone, especially Thorne, from reaching the Kalen. He ran back toward the triage bay, the heavy sound of his boots echoing against the synthetic floor, his knee protesting the sudden physical strain. He needed to get to Alara, to tell her to abort the Level 4 transfer, or they were walking the Kalen straight into the execution chamber. He rounded the corner past the supply depot and stopped short. Commander Rourke was standing directly in the middle of the corridor, flanked by 2 armed security officers. She was no longer a dutiful subordinate. She was a physical obstacle, the embodiment of wartime statute 44B. Her expression was cold, professionally disappointed. She held his own heavy energy pistol, now removed from her hip holster, pointed at the floor, but ready. General Thorne, Rourke's voice was clipped, military. Per sector-wide directive B9er, you are relieved of active command pending immediate high sector review. You will accompany me to the secure holding cell. Thorne gripped the frame of the doorway, breathing hard, the metallic scent of ozone from the overworked network stinging his nostrils. Commander, the lockdown is a diversion. That prisoner, the Kalen, is about to be murdered. Kendall has initiated an untraceable kill order. I need to get to Nurse Alara now. Rourke did not flinch. Her training was absolute. That is non-standard combat intelligence, General. The only threat assessed at this moment is your documented act of unauthorized network tampering and the refusal to follow manifest protocols. The detainee is a logistical issue, not an existential one. Lower your voice and comply. Logistical issue? Thorne demanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. He's 78 years old, Rourke. He carries the brand of a weapon I approved 20 years ago. He is the history of this war, and they are trying to erase him because he's inconvenient proof that we started this, and we failed to finish it cleanly. The officers behind Rourke shifted uncomfortably, hearing the general's near hysteria. Rourke, however, seemed only to harden further. She was loyal to the command, not to the man. Your distress is noted, General. If the prisoner is of such classified historical value, High Sector Command will analyze the body post-mortem. Your priority now is security compliance. She took a step forward, a silent, official demand for surrender. Thorne could see the absolute lack of compromise in her eyes. She was a wall of cold, logical duty. He realized that reasoning, confession, or threat were useless. Rourke had secured his weapon. She had the immediate loyalty of the security detail, and the entire sector was in lockdown mode. He was completely isolated. His mind worked feverishly. He needed time, and Rourke was buying time for Kendall's cipher to execute. He glanced past her, toward the triage bay entrance, now bathed in pulsating red emergency lights. He saw a flash of white movement. Ilara was in the bay. She was racing against the clock, trying to stabilize the Kalen, completely unaware that the countdown was digital, not medical. He had one last advantage: his total clearance in the physical structure of the bunker. If he couldn't stop the cipher, he could create a crisis so overwhelming that the lockdown would fracture, and Rourke would be forced to react. "I gave you an order, Commander," Thorne said, his voice flat and controlled, masking the cold dread gripping his stomach. Rourke raised the energy pistol slightly. "I am upholding the law, General. Drop your hands and turn around." Thorne didn't drop his hands. Instead, he slammed his thumb onto the emergency override panel built into the corridor wall, the one controlling external air filtration for Sector 7 Delta. He didn't want to vent the entire sector. That was madness. He just needed the distraction. He targeted the main intake manifold and forced an immediate, catastrophic pressure inversion. The blast was muffled, localized, but physically violent. A loud whoomp echoed through the corridors as the manifold buckled, instantly rupturing a low-pressure coolant line near the ventilation hub. Steam and pressurized cryogenic vapor immediately filled the corridor, blinding the security officers. The emergency lights flickered, momentarily plunging everything into darkness, only to return violently, strobing red. Rourke gasped, dropping her posture slightly as the sudden pressure shift hit them. She didn't drop the gun, but her focus fractured. Containment breach, central maintenance, report. Thorne didn't wait. He shoved past her, his momentum combined with the sudden burst of vapor sending her staggering back against the wall. The security officers were momentarily disoriented, struggling to activate their vision enhancers through the haze. He didn't have time to retrieve his pistol. He sprinted toward the triage bay, ignoring the burning pain in his knee. He burst into the red-lit triage bay. Chaos reigned. The medical staff were rushing to shut down sensitive machinery. Nurse Ilara was hunched over the Kalen. Thorne saw her pulling an entire life support module, a portable oxygen recycler and IV drip system, onto a gravity cart. She was moving with desperate, focused efficiency. "Ilara, stop. Don't move him to level 4. It's compromised," Thorne shouted over the shrieking containment alarm. Ilara looked up, her face streaked with sweat and illuminated by the frantic red flashes. Her eyes held not fear, but a grim understanding. "I know, General. The level 4 filtration just went offline. Too convenient." She hadn't followed his initial instruction, anticipating the possibility of compromise. She had prepared an alternative. Instead of turning toward the primary security elevator, she wrenched the gravity cart into a narrow, unlit maintenance access that led down into the sublevels, a crawl space known only to maintenance crews and high command. I found a secondary, isolated med bay, she yelled back, her voice barely audible. It's cold storage, barely sanctioned, but Kendall won't track standard medical transport down there. Not yet. She disappeared into the darkness of the sub-level crawl space, pushing the heavy cart containing the 78-year-old warrior. Thorn lunged to follow her, but before he could step through the narrow access point, a shimmering, razor-sharp blue light materialized directly in the center of the triage bay, cutting him off. High Sector Marshal Kendall's holographic projection was back, not confined to the command post, but projected fully into the physical space, standing right where the Kalin had lain moments before. The Marshal's image was unnervingly stable despite the screaming alarms and the chaotic red light. "You are surprisingly predictable, Thorn." Kendall's voice was calm, cutting through the noise like laser-etched glass. He wasn't even addressing the sabotage. He was addressing Thorn's defiance. "For a general, your attachment to history has become a dangerous liability. The Sector 7 Delta containment breach is a punishable offense, but minor. What worries me, Elias, is the pattern. You spend 20 years burying the evidence of the Elias mark, and the moment it surfaces, you risk your career, your reputation, and the lives of your men to protect it." Rourke, momentarily recovering from the blast, rounded the corner, her pistol now aimed squarely at Thorn's back. "General, surrender now." Thorn ignored her. He stared into the perfectly composed holographic face of the Marshal. Ilara had bought him seconds, but he was trapped between the Marshal's physical presence, Rourke's gun, and the deeper digital snare, Kendall's projection. Kendall's thin, empty smile widened just slightly. "You believed the problem was contained to that prisoner, didn't you, Elias? You thought if you saved that one Kalin, the sin would be absolved. You failed to realize that your little historical anomaly was only the trigger for a far larger, far more critical operation. You spent so long looking at the mark, you missed the real target." Thorn felt a crushing weight descend upon him. What operation? "The Kalin is not a logistical issue, Thorn. He is a message," Kendall stated, his voice now layered with cold triumph. "The true order I issued was not a kill cipher for one unit. It was the synchronized, sector-wide activation of the 23 Kalin survivors carrying the mark that we have captured over the last 2 decades. Every single one has been kept in deep sector containment, waiting. Your little defiance confirmed they are still biologically relevant, and your unauthorized access just provided the biometric security override needed to activate them all simultaneously. They are waking up now, General. 23 highly trained, 20-year veteran Kalin warriors deep within our most sensitive sectors. The war you tried to stop 20 years ago just restarted from the inside." Rourke screamed, a sound of pure terror, as the holographic Marshal vanished, replaced by a simple line of flashing red text across the wall. "Sector-wide Kalin containment breach. Confirmed. All units. Assume maximum hostility." Thorn stood paralyzed, trapped between Rourke's shaky pistol and the realization that his attempt to save one man had just triggered a catastrophic security failure, unleashing 23 living-time bombs across the command structure. He had not resolved the damage. He had magnified it 20-fold. He had traded a quiet murder for total internal war. Thorn didn't waste time looking at the Marshal's dissolved projection or the petrified Rourke. The sector-wide alarm was the only weapon he had left. He dropped low and lunged through the narrow maintenance access Ilara had vanished into. The crawl space was a claustrophobic maze of cold synth steel ductwork, smelling of machine grease and stagnant water, a stark, filthy contrast to the immaculate triage bay. He landed hard on the sub-level grating. his damaged knee shrieking in protest. He ignored the pain, listening to the echoing clang of the gravity cart Elara was pushing ahead of him. Behind him, the corridor alarms were deafening, and he could hear Rourke's strained shouts over the internal comms. General Thorne is unauthorized. Lock down all egress points. Sector 7 Delta is compromised. Thorne crawled forward, the red emergency lights barely penetrating the grime-coated pipes. He finally caught up to Elara in a small pocket of reinforced concrete, the isolated, decommissioned cryo-storage unit she'd mentioned. She had the cart wedged against a dormant cooling matrix. The Kalen lay still, his oxygen supply hissing steadily, the only sound of life in the metallic tomb. "General, we have maybe 90 seconds before they track the supplemental oxygen emissions down here," Elara whispered, her face pale under the faint light. She had abandoned her pristine uniform for a utilitarian field jacket, suggesting she had been preparing for this flight long before the crisis. "Kendall has activated 23 other Kalen carrying the mark. He used my override. It's an internal disaster," Thorne ground out, pressing his spine against the cold concrete, trying to regulate his breathing. Elara didn't react with shock, only grim confirmation. 23. Of course. Why stop at one historical anomaly when you can weaponize 2 decades of them? She pulled a small shielded data drive from her jacket pocket, connecting it to a diagnostic port near the Kalen's cot. "General, that mark isn't just a scar. It's why this war hasn't ended. It's why we are still alive." Thorne felt a cold dread supersede the panic. "Elaborate, nurse. The air on this sector, General. The dust storms, the metallic taste. It's not just pulverized rock. It's the constant breakdown of our atmospheric recycling. We're losing the war against our own environment, not the Kalen. Human viability on these frontier worlds is dropping exponentially. Within 50 years, we cannot sustain the population without a complete biological overhaul or a new atmospheric stabilizer." Elara gestured at the unconscious Kalen. "The phase shift disruptor, the weapon you authorized 20 years ago, was a failure at killing, yes, but it was a catastrophic success at forcing adaptation. The Elias mark is the physical evidence of their successful biological response to radical energy trauma. That chaotic tissue around the sternum, its highly advanced biological filtration, it allows the Kalen to process the thin, toxic air we can barely tolerate. They aren't just enduring the war, General. They are adapting to our ecological collapse." The full horror of the revelation hit Thorne with physical force. This wasn't about vengeance or territory. This was about desperate, systemic survival. "The command doesn't want to kill the Kalen, General," Elara continued, her voice gaining intensity. "They need their biology. They need the genetic secrets coded within that scar tissue. The Kalen are not enemies. They are the key to human survival." "And the 23 prisoners?" Thorne asked, the words heavy and metallic in his mouth. "They have been kept in stasis for 2 decades. The research division calls them biological anchors. They were preserved, not for intelligence, but for eventual harvest. To extract the mark's secrets, they need live, active samples. Kendall's job wasn't to win the war. It was to manage the 23 test subjects until the technology was ready. Your unauthorized access confirmed the viability of the original Kalen, giving Kendall the green light to activate the entire reserve." Thorne gripped the edge of the cot, his knuckles white. He had spent 2 decades believing his sin was authorizing a weapon that created horrific scars. Now he realized the real sin was creating a biological imperative that doomed an entire species to be perpetually hunted for the sake of his own. The war was a massive, bloody smokescreen designed to hide the fact that they were farming the enemy. The air in the small cryo-storage unit was thick with the weight of the impossible choice. To survive, humanity must commit industrial-scale genocide by harvesting the very biological resistance its own weapons created. Thorn stood at the edge of the abyss, the moral ground dissolving beneath him. He could work with Kendall, use his unique knowledge of the mark to help capture and stabilize the 23 Kalen. This path saves humanity from slow suffocation, but at the cost of monstrous ethical purity. He would become the general who optimized mass murder for survival, or he could commit everything to freeing the 23, condemning billions of humans on failing worlds to a gradual environmental death. I am a man who uses trauma as a shield, he thought, looking at the scarred Kalen. I saved this one man to absolve myself of my first mistake. If I betray humanity now, am I a selfless martyr, or just a coward who couldn't bear the final, necessary sacrifice? Ilara placed a hand on his arm, her touch cold and steady. The 23 Kalen are now loose. Kendall is deploying rapid capture squads disguised as anti-terrorist units. If those Kalen are captured, they will be rushed to deep sector extraction facilities, starting with the one closest to their biological prime. We have 2 minutes before Rourke figures out the access point. Where is the nearest extraction facility? Thorn asked, his voice low and utterly devoid of emotion, the shift from moral panic to deadly pragmatism complete. Sector Gamma, the old research colony on Proxima's third moon. It's the original testing ground for the phase shift disruptor. Kendall loves symbolism. Thorn looked at the injured Kalen. This survivor was the physical memory of his mistake, the only leverage he had. The 23 others were scattered time bombs. We need a ship, Thorn stated, moving to the diagnostic port Ilara was using. A fast, untraceable transport. Something not logged in the immediate manifest. Something I commanded decades ago. Impossible. Rourke is locking down the external manifests. You're a fugitive, General. No clearance is active. Thorn began typing rapidly, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of a commander who had logged thousands of sensitive manifests. I still have access to the Icarus Redux logs. It's a heavy freighter, decommissioned 15 years ago, but officially listed as long-term deep space patrol. A ghost ship only I know the activation codes for. It's docked at the Forgotten Supply Station, 7 kilometers from here. His plan was reckless, born from desperation. He wouldn't choose between genocide and collapse. He would choose a third, more dangerous path, isolation. He would gather the 23 Kalen himself, take them and the original survivor, and disappear, using their collective biological secret as the ultimate, non-negotiable bargaining chip against high sector command. The Icarus is shielded, but slow, Ilara said, reading the schematics flashing on her small screen. We can make it if we disable the main sector communications array first, buying us an hour of dead air. But you need to activate the freighter's launch sequence from here, and the access point is exposed. I know, Thorn replied, overriding the comms panel. He began the sequence. Redux override. Protocol Elias Mark 801. Authorization. Full command. Just as the preliminary activation signal locked onto the dormant freighter, a fierce grinding sound ripped through the ceiling of the cryo-storage unit. Rourke and the security detail had deployed a high-frequency plasma torch, cutting directly through the heavy concrete, ignoring the standard maintenance access points. A piece of hot metal fell to the floor, smoking. Commander Rourke's face appeared through the gap, illuminated by the plasma residue. Her expression hardened into pure, unforgiving duty. I gave you the chance to surrender, General, Rourke shouted over the screeching metal. You refused. Stand away from the console and leave the prisoner. Thorn didn't move. The Icarus Redux activation was at 92%. Rourke raised his heavy energy pistol. She didn't hesitate. She fired once. The blast didn't hit Thorn, It struck the cryo-storage console where the Icarus activation was running. The metallic tang of ozone and burned circuitry filled the small room, instantly killing the power. The screen went dark. "Protocol terminated," Rourke stated, her voice shaking slightly but steady. "We are now proceeding with high-sector custody transfer. You have lost your leverage, Thorne. You have lost everything." Thorne stared at the smoking ruin of the console. The Icarus Redux was dead, the launch sequence aborted. His attempt at an escape route, a safe zone for the Kaelin, and his only means of negotiating humanity's future had been instantly vaporized by his own weapon, wielded by his former protégé. He had successfully turned himself into a traitor, risked the sector, and all he had to show for it was a dead end. "Not everything, Commander," Thorne said, turning slowly. He ignored the burning debris and focused on the physical object of his first failure. "The Kaelin on the cart. You just guaranteed that Marshal Kendall will not stop until he has 24 subjects, not 23. And now you have forced the fight into the dark." He shoved the Kaelin's cart violently forward, right into a secondary pipe access, sealing it with a blast of compressed air from the ruptured coolant line. He then launched himself at the concrete wall opposite the opening Rourke had cut. Activating a demolition charge he'd managed to grab from the triage supplies during the initial chaos. He hit the detonator the moment Rourke began to drop through the hole. The resulting concussion was deafening, localized, but massive. The wall collapsed, not outward, but inward, sealing the cryo-storage unit behind a mountain of debris and dust. Thorne was thrown back into the darkness of the sublevels, his ears ringing, separated completely from Ilara, the Kaelin, and the entire high-sector command structure. He was alone, bleeding, without communications, and committed to a war he could not win. A war that was not against the Kaelin, but against the very definition of human survival. He had paid the highest cost, isolation and failure. Now he would fight in the dark, knowing his desperation had just gifted Kendall a priceless 24th subject. Him. He was the only remaining high-level strategist who knew the secrets of the Elias Mark, and Kendall needed him alive. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The silence that fell upon the sublevels was not natural. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total structural failure, filled only by the grinding hiss of dust settling back onto scorched synth steel. Thorne lay buried under a cascade of powdered concrete and ruptured pipes, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that muffled all thought. The metallic tang of ozone and spent demolition charges filled his lungs, a smell worse than failure. It smelled like a dead end. He fought his way out of the debris, moving with the sluggish, agonizing effort of a man pulling himself from deep mud. His knee, already damaged, flared in blinding protest, and he knew instantly the collateral damage was severe. He was breathing heavily, the fine dust coating his throat and making every inhale a shallow, metallic rasp. He was alone, without a weapon, bleeding from a dozen minor cuts, and structurally compromised. He had traded a quiet act of sabotage for a major containment breach, resulting only in his isolation. After 3 minutes of crawling, he found a relatively clear section of the service tunnel. He braced himself against a bundle of inert optical cables, trying to clear the ringing in his ears. The gravity cart and Ilara were gone. The secondary pipe access he had sealed with the air blast remained clamped shut, a perfect, silent seal. He had secured the Kaelin's temporary escape route, but now he had no way to follow, no way to confirm Ilara's location, and no assurance she was alive. He was officially a runaway failure. He pressed his fingers to his throat, locating the pulsing carotid artery. trying to reassert control over a body that felt completely alien. He needed information. He needed to know if Rourke had penetrated the seal and found them, or if the blast had bought Ilara the precious few minutes she needed. Following the main power conduit, a massive, humming cylinder that felt dangerously hot, Thorne located a decommissioned diagnostics terminal wedged into the floor, an obsolete piece of machinery used for atmospheric calibration. He forced the cover plate open with a shard of metal and began linking the terminal to the bunker's tertiary network, bypassing the mainframe lockdown using command protocols so archaic Kendall's AI filters likely ignored them. The screen flickered to life, showing only jagged lines and errors. He ignored the noise and demanded only one thing: Sector 7 Delta status reports. The data came in fragments, but the picture was chillingly clear. Kendall had won. The containment breach had been managed within 7 minutes. The official report, signed by Commander Rourke, listed General Thorne as a rogue element, presumed hostile, priority target for neutralization. The secondary report confirmed the Kalen. Biological anchor O1 stabilized and transferred to secure, isolated custody, location classified. Ilara was listed merely as Nurse Ilara Rivas, detained pending investigation for collaboration and breach of Statute 44B. Thorne stared at the stark, clinical language: stabilized, detained. No mention of extraction, but the implication was a death sentence for both, or worse, a living sacrifice. His entire reckless gambit had failed completely, resulting in his former ally being placed under Kendall's immediate jurisdiction. Rourke's precise shot at the Icarus Redux console hadn't just terminated his escape, it had sealed the fate of Ilara and the Kalen. He rested his forehead against the cold metal casing of the terminal. The residual metallic taste of the ozone mixed with the bitter taste of utter defeat. He searched the manifest logs, hoping for a clue to the Kalen's new location, a transport ship, a specific unit designation. Nothing. Kendall had scrubbed the data perfectly, leaving only Rourke's concise, professionally delivered proof of Thorne's failure. He had believed, in the small, frantic hope of the moment, that if he could just escape with the Kalen, he could negotiate. But he was neither a savior nor a strategist now. He was a liability being hunted by his own former subordinate. Thorne pulled back from the screen, his chest tight. This was the bottom. He had lost the subject, lost his only ally, and lost his freedom, all while confirming the precise nature of the biological anchors for the High Command. He had, in effect, done Kendall's final assessment for him. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of self-contempt returning, heavier than the debris he had crawled out from. It settled on his shoulders, an ancient, persistent ache. "Why do you still fight, Elias?" The thought was internal, a voice rusty and worn down by 20 years of dust and self-justification. "For the Kalen, they will die regardless, either by our war or by our harvest. For Ilara, you only involved her because you needed absolution. You used her. You used the entire sector collapse as a shield for your own ego." He saw himself in the reflective synth steel of the terminal screen, a tired man with bloodied hands and gray hair, clinging desperately to an ethical purity he lost the moment he signed the phase shift disruptor mandate. He wasn't a hero trying to save the world. He was a coward running from the responsibility of having condemned it 20 years ago. The tragedy of the situation wasn't that he might die, but that he was forcing others to die with him in a pointless gesture of delayed defiance. "It would be easier to surrender," the voice whispered. "Easier to face the military court, take the sentence, and end this exhausting responsibility." He closed his eyes. He didn't want to be the one who failed the 24, but he already was. Thorne forced himself to open his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He began reviewing the residual power logs of the destroyed Icarus Redux console, hunting for any anomalous power draw, any sign that Alara had been able to do more than simply abort the launch. The logs were nearly zeroed, scorched by the energy pistol blast. But deep within the fragmented metadata, Thorn found a ghost signature, a spike of high-frequency transmission power, far exceeding the capability of the local diagnostics terminal just microseconds before the console failed. It was too focused to be a broadcast, too brief to be a complex transmission. It was a burst beacon. Alara hadn't been activating the Icarus. She had realized the escape was compromised and, using the powerful internal comms of the freighter console, sent a single, encrypted ping. Thorn ran the trace on the transmission's destination vector. The result flashed on the dusty screen, making the darkness momentarily bright. Sector Gamma, Proxima's third moon. He stared at the coordinates. Alara hadn't tried to run away from Kendall's extraction facility. She had aimed the signal directly at it. She wasn't trying to escape. She was giving up on the passive defense and betting everything on a direct, reckless infiltration. She assumed that if Kendall was transporting the Kalen to Sector Gamma, then the highest concentration of the Mark survivors and the best chance for disruption was there. And she expected Thorn to follow. The beacon was a trap and an invitation. If he went to Sector Gamma, he would be walking straight into Kendall's secure zone, probably minutes behind the capture teams, but it was the only direction left that wasn't surrender. Thorn searched the sector schematics. The fastest way to the main external dock, 7 kilometers away, where he had hoped the Icarus would be, was through the main environmental ventilation conduits. A maze of unfiltered, corrosive air designed to vent the worst toxins from the operational sectors. He remembered Ilara's words. That chaotic tissue around the sternum, its highly advanced biological filtration. It allows the Kalen to process the thin, toxic air we can barely tolerate. The air in the conduits was lethal to an unsuited human, especially one with dust-choked lungs and failing respiration. It was an environment designed for suffocation. But that environment was the Kalen's advantage, and now it was Thorn's only route. He had to trust that his 78-year-old enemy's biological strength was the only defense he needed. Thorn shoved himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his knee. He picked up the heavy metal shard he'd used to pry open the terminal, his only weapon. He found the access hatch for the main ventilation conduit a few meters away, a heavy, rusting portal marked only with a faded biohazard symbol. He braced the metal shard against the manual release latch. The only way to open it was to smash the ancient locking mechanism, triggering a massive, irreversible air pressure change and a high-level security alert. It would be a suicide run. Thorn didn't hesitate. He swung the metal shard once, with all the remaining strength in his 62-year-old body, shattering the locking mechanism. The latch exploded inward, and with a deafening, toxic whoosh, the conduit opened, unleashing a blast of hot, metallic, unfiltered air that choked and burned his eyes. He lunged forward, ignoring the instant, searing pain in his lungs, plunging into the darkness of the main conduit, heading toward the surface. He was relying on the knowledge gleaned from a scar to survive an atmosphere designed to kill him, betting his last chance on the adaptation of the enemy he had created. As he crawled into the roaring darkness, a final, horrifying realization struck him. Kendall hadn't just secured the Kalen and Alara. The Marshal had already tracked the destination of the burst beacon. Kendall wasn't just managing the problem. He was waiting for Thorn at Sector Gamma. Thorn had just confirmed his loyalty to the Kalen and his willingness to sacrifice himself to reach them. The trap was sprung. The metallic tang of the ventilation conduit air was no longer merely a smell. It was a physical acid burning the lining of his lungs. Thorn gripped a hot cable sheath, pulling himself forward, his damaged knee grinding bone against metal with every movement. The air, designed to kill, forced him into a staggering, near catatonic state. He gasped, the rasping sound tearing at his throat. He had less than 10 minutes before the toxins caused permanent neural collapse. He could not breathe the way a human breathes. He forced the shallow, rapid, rhythmic cycles he had deduced from the 20-year-old physiological data on the Elias mark. The Kalin, his first victim, had developed chaotic, regenerative tissue that maximized oxygen extraction from minimal, polluted air. Thorn, a 62-year-old human, was trying to emulate an enemy's biological miracle through sheer, agonizing willpower. He wasn't breathing. He was enduring. He was surviving through the technical specifications of his own original sin. The pain was a white-hot blanket, but it was predictable. He focused on the data, the specific frequency of breath, the constriction of the throat, the minimal expansion of the chest, and this focused task became a shield against the rising wave of nausea and fear. He realized that this was the difference between himself and the men under his command. They fought to win. He fought to resolve a calculation. The internal journey, 7 kilometers long, felt like 7 decades. Finally, the conduit opened onto the massive, abandoned maintenance bay of the deep sector dock. The air here was slightly cleaner, filtered by the high, cold atmosphere of the Proxima Moon outpost. He tumbled out onto the synth steel floor, coughing violently, the corrosive air leaving him weak and shaking. He found the Icarus Redux launch bay. The massive transport ship, officially decommissioned, was still docked, its primary console scorched from Rourke's pistol shot. But beneath the debris, Thorn saw what Ilara's beacon had confirmed. A high-speed transport shuttle, sleek and black, was already loading cargo near the Icarus, its engine humming silently. This was Kendall's extraction vehicle. The bay was vast and silent, dimly lit by emergency strobes. Thorn pulled himself up, using the heavy metal shard from the sub-level terminal as a crude crutch. He was bleeding freely, his uniform ripped, the dust and grime making him look like a relic unearthed from the perpetual storms outside. He saw no guards, no immediate threat. The silence was heavier than the chaos had been, clearly engineered. High Sector Marshal Kendall stood 20 meters away, near the open shuttle ramp. He was still impeccably dressed in his crisp whites, a contrast so stark it felt like a moral judgment. He wasn't surrounded by security. Only Commander Rourke stood beside him, holding Thorn's heavy energy pistol, her face an unreadable mask of duty. "General Thorn," Kendall said, his voice calm, projecting perfectly in the massive chamber. "You look unwell. The environmental air in the transit conduit is rated lethal for prolonged exposure. You chose the fastest route to suicide, or perhaps the fastest route to my custody. I am glad you chose the latter." Thorn leaned heavily on the metal shard, struggling to force oxygen into his burning lungs. "Ilara's beacon. You knew I would follow the signal to Sector Gamma." "Of course," Kendall replied, a slight, humorless curve to his lip. "You are predictable, Elias. You had 20 years to bury your original mistake. The moment the Kalin appeared, you focused entirely on the guilt and the path to absolution. You believed if you could secure the first anchor, the rest of the problem would solve itself. I merely provided the coordinates for your self-sacrifice." Kendall gestured toward the shuttle. "The prisoner is secure. Ilara Rivas is secure. She performed admirably, confirming the viability of Anchor 01 and, critically, confirming your loyalty to him. You see, General, your failure wasn't the disruptor. Your failure was believing this was a war of ethics, not logistics. We do not need to win the war, Elias. We only need to survive. And survival means harvesting 23 prisoners who survived my failure." Thorn wheezed. the effort of speaking almost crippling. It means leveraging biological assets we cannot replicate, Kendall corrected, devoid of malice. They are the key to human viability in the face of ecological collapse. You, Thorn, are the key to the mark's technological replication. You know the classified design flaws, the specific energy outputs. Your capture simplifies my entire operation. Thorn looked at Rourke, whose eyes remained fixed straight ahead. He had used Rourke's sense of duty against her. He had used Ilara's compassion, and he had failed them both. Now he was trapped. Kendall had anticipated everything. "The manifest, Marshal," Thorn rasped, trying to keep his voice steady. "The manifest for the 23 anchors are still listed as active in Central Command. When you move them, you confirm the internal breach. That data will trigger a sector-wide inquiry, bypassing your authority." Kendall laughed, a dry, small sound. "That is precisely why you are so essential. Your confession, combined with your technical knowledge, will allow me to retroactively adjust the manifest data. In 24 hours, all 24 anchors, including you, will be listed as casualties of the Sector 7 Delta breach. Neat, clean, closed ledger. The institutional weight of this war rests on efficient accounting, Elias, something you seem to have forgotten." Thorn took a shaky, painful step forward, dragging his foot. The intense, burning pain in his knee was a steady, cold anchor amidst the mental turmoil. He looked at the heavy metal shard in his hand, useless as a weapon against a pistol. Kendall motioned slightly, and Rourke tightened her grip on Thorn's pistol. "Surrender now, General. We can still stabilize the damage to your respiratory system. Your knowledge is too valuable to waste." Thorn shook his head, a single sharp motion. "You think my value is knowledge. You miss the point, Marshal. My value is my failure." He took another step, then another, moving toward the primary manifest console built into the dock structure, the one that managed external shipments. He wasn't running from them. He was running at his final objective. Rourke raised the energy pistol. "Stop, General. I will fire." "Fire, Commander," Thorn commanded, his voice thin but carrying the absolute authority of 2 decades of command. Rourke hesitated. She lowered the pistol slightly, not out of mercy, but out of conflicting duty. That half-second was all Thorn needed. He didn't attack Kendall. He didn't attack Rourke. He swung the heavy metal shard in a wide, desperate arc and slammed it into the external dock manifest console. The console didn't explode. It shattered violently, sending shards of synth steel and sparking wires flying across the bay. The impact itself was negligible, but what Thorn did in the fraction of a second before the shatter was the pivot. He had pressed the shard against the master power port and executed an instantaneous hardwired command he'd learned to use to disable field sensors 20 years ago. The command didn't destroy the manifest. It didn't expose the project. Instead, it instantly and globally updated the status of all 23 captured Kalen anchors. The entire dock facility alarm system shrieked, a high, piercing electronic scream that wasn't the lockdown alarm, but a data integrity alarm. Kendall's composure cracked for the first time. "What did you do?" Thorn collapsed onto the ruined console, coughing out a plume of metallic dust and blood. "I confirmed your manifest, Marshal. All 23 anchors. They are now officially listed as processed, target decommissioned." Silence fell, filled only by the screaming alarm. Kendall stared at Thorn with pure intellectual outrage. "The system is built to assume data integrity, Marshal," Thorn gasped, resting his forehead on the cold console debris. "The official record now states that all 23 Kalen are dead. You cannot harvest dead units. You cannot retroactively adjust a massive data loss without triggering a high-sector probe that will take months, perhaps years to resolve. Your clean, efficient extraction operation is over. You have to hunt them again, officially, using resources, time, and visible casualties." Kendall's face twisted in controlled fury. "You have only created a bureaucratic nightmare, Thorn. The Kalen are still alive. We will find them. You have gained nothing but insubordination and permanent detention. I gained time, Marshal, Thorne said, spitting out a mouthful of blood onto the floor, and I changed the narrative. The war is no longer a silent harvest. It is a visible, costly chase. Now, the High Command has to look. He had traded a quiet, efficient end for a loud, ugly continuation. A defeat for himself, but a victory for transparency. Kendall had won the man, but lost the means. Kendall took 2 swift steps forward, stopping right over Thorne. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a frustrated engineer whose carefully laid plans had been contaminated by a single, messy variable. "And what of your ally, Nurse Rivas?" Kendall demanded. "You thought her beacon was guiding you to her rescue. It was a lure. She is being transferred for deep sector interrogation. The Kalen you saved, Anchor 01, has been moved to a temporary holding outside Sector Gamma, awaiting assessment. You risked your life based on outdated intelligence, Elias. Your pragmatism failed." Thorne looked up at the Marshal, a faint, dark smile touching his bloodied lips. "You said she was detained, Marshal. You didn't say where. That burst beacon, the one you tracked to Sector Gamma, it wasn't a destination signal. It was a directional vector. She told me where the Kalen wasn't, and I knew you would track me, not the anchor. She used your focus on my failure to hide her only leverage." Kendall paused, his eyes narrowing, finally recognizing the deep, layered complexity of the nurse's defiance. Thorne slumped further onto the wreckage, his body finally shutting down. The toxins, the blast, the chronic pain, they demanded their price. He felt Rourke step up, securing his wrist. He was a prisoner. "It will be a long process, General," Kendall stated, regaining his cold composure. "But we will extract the information we need, and you will still die." "Perhaps," Thorne managed, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at his shaking hands, covered in his own blood and the dust of the conduits. The nervous system damage from the corrosive air was already permanent. He knew he would never again have the steady control required for command, or for fixing complicated machinery. He had sacrificed his identity as a strategist and a technician for a single act of defiance. He accepted his fate. He was not a hero. He was a deeply flawed man who had failed 2 decades ago, and whose only path to final resolution was to pay the price for that failure, one agonizing minute at a time. Rourke dragged him toward the shuttle ramp, her grip firm and unforgiving. He passed the open maw of the shuttle. He saw the gleam of containment restraints inside. He was now Anchor 00, the high-value biological asset who knew too much. As he was dragged into the cold confines of the prisoner hold, Kendall stood over the ruined manifest console, already contacting Central Command, beginning the long, slow, visible fight to explain 23 missing assets. Thorne closed his eyes. He had won a temporary silence for the 23, and a future of endless logistical headaches for Kendall. But the cost was absolute. He was a captive, crippled, with nothing left but the knowledge that he had managed to make the war honest, if only for a few hours. The air in the shuttle was recycled and clean, but it didn't smell like victory. It smelled like the deep, metallic, enduring bitterness of permanent damage. He had 7 days of life left, if the doctors were generous, and an interrogation to survive. He had chosen the fight, and now he had to live, or die, with the consequences. The transition from the toxic furnace of the ventilation conduits to the sterile, recycled air of the shuttle's medbay was not relief. It was an amputation. Thorne awoke to the steady hum of life support systems and the blinding white light of a medical droid hovering over him. The metallic smell that had defined the war, ozone, dust, and anxiety, was gone, replaced by the sharp tang of biocleanser and pure clinical efficiency. He tried to move his hand. It shook violently, a high-frequency tremor that was neither controllable nor stoppable. He tried to flex his knee. It didn't respond, a searing, dead weight stitched into his thigh. The medical droid, reading his vitals, injected a sedative, but Thorne fought the haze, needing absolute clarity for the final accounting. Rourke stood beside him, still holding his energy pistol, which now seemed impossibly heavy and useless in the sterile environment. She watched him with the detached, unwavering gaze of a sentry. Thorne was stabilized, cocooned in the state-of-the-art care reserved for assets too valuable to lose. He was the most dangerous kind of prisoner, one whose mind was necessary, but whose body was now irrelevant. "The nervous system damage is permanent, General," Rourke stated, her voice devoid of inflection, a final operational report delivered without emotion. "The corrosive air, it burned the neural sheaths. You will never regain full motor control in your left leg or arm. You will be reliant on stabilization implants if you cooperate." Thorne managed a grim smile, his lips cracked and dry. He did not ask for a mirror. He knew his face would show the exhaustion of 20 years, finally made visible in the permanent damage of his final act. "Cooperation is contingent on information, Commander," Thorne rasped, his throat raw. "Ilara, the Kalen, where are they?" Rourke did not look away. "Nurse Rivas is in deep sector isolation. Kendall requires immediate confirmation of the anchor's current status. She is refusing to confirm the directional vector you claimed she transmitted." "She hid him," Thorne concluded, the pride mixing oddly with the physical agony. "She used the Marshal's focus on my capture to ensure the first survivor, the oldest memory of my failure, would remain free." Rourke sighed, a subtle, tired sound that finally broke her professional mask. It was the only crack in her duty he had ever witnessed. "She surrendered, General," Rourke corrected him, her voice low. The Kalen was briefly secured in the secondary pipe access. Rivas locked the final seal and transmitted a message to the Kalen's unknown destination. "Continue." She then walked out and surrendered to the Sector 7 Delta recovery teams, offering herself as leverage against Kendall's pursuit of Anchor 01. Thorne closed his eyes. He had assumed defiance. Ilara had chosen sacrifice. He had created a momentary political shield, the decommissioning of the 23 anchors. She had created a temporary biological shield, the freedom of the original anchor. He was a strategist. She was a humanist. He had chosen the costly fight. She had chosen the necessary sacrifice. She chose the life that mattered, Thorne whispered. She chose insubordination, and now faces execution, Rourke countered, her duty reasserting itself. She held up his polished energy pistol. "You wanted to know the cost of the war, General? This is it. You pay in blood, time, or the lives of those you influence. You cost Rivas her life, Thorne, and you cost me my career, holding this." She carefully placed the pistol back in its empty hip holster slot on his harness, now secured to the cot. It was an act of final symbolic judgment. It was no longer his symbol of command. It was a physical artifact of his capture, a dead weight he was now forced to carry. "I accept the cost, Commander," Thorne said, settling back into the restraints. He understood then that his great victory was not a moral victory over Kendall, but a structural one over the system's ability to remain silent. By publicly listing the 23 anchors as decommissioned, he forced the bureaucratic inertia to work against Kendall. The High Command would spend years investigating the falsified records, the massive phantom loss of 23 assets, diverting resources from the hidden war to the tedious war of accounting. He had made the war visible and expensive. His final realization was not one of redemption, but of profound, exhausted acceptance. He was General Elias Thorne, the man who had authorized a weapon of ethical failure, and whose body now bore the physical signature of that failure, the crippled leg, the shaking hands, the lungs permanently seared by his own environment. The scars had finally caught up to the commander. He looked down at his hands, watching the ceaseless tremor. He would never again operate a console, never again hold a weapon steady, never again fix a broken circuit. He had traded technical mastery for moral clarity. This permanent, physical limitation was his penance, not for what he had done to the Kalen 20 years ago, but for what he had allowed himself to become in the intervening decades, a disconnected calculator of lives. He was now nothing more than raw memory, a liability. Kendall entered the med bay, his crisp white uniform untouched by the grime and chaos of the past few hours. He carried a data slate, already preparing the interrogation. "The Kalen is gone, Elias," Kendall admitted, a flicker of genuine annoyance in his voice. "Rivas ensured that, but the coordinates she sent him to are likely within the Proxima system. He is a 78-year-old biological unit running on residual energy. He won't survive long without advanced medical intervention. We will find him. We will find Ilara's location, and we will find the rest of the 23. You have merely prolonged the inevitable." "Perhaps," Thorne said, his voice calmer now, detached. "But the inevitable must now be executed in the open, Marshal. You have to hunt living humans again, not harvest dead statistics. That changes the calculus." Kendall looked down at the general, not with cruelty, but with the cold, pure disappointment reserved for flawed instruments. "It changes nothing for you, Elias. You are now officially dead. You are a biological anchor, a high-value data asset, and you will be processed. The war goes on." Thorne merely nodded, closing his eyes against the sterile light. The metallic taste of the recycled air in the bunker, thin and smelling faintly of ozone and old dust, the combination which had defined the last 20 years of his life, was gone. The shuttle air was clean, but the bitter knowledge remained. He had spent 2 decades running from the memory of the damage he inflicted, only to find peace in becoming the damage itself. His interrogation would be long, his death would be efficient, but for the first time in 20 years, the ledger, even if it cost him everything, was finally balanced. He breathed the perfectly filtered air, accepting the constant, rhythmic tremor in his crippled hands, the permanent weight of the fallen pistol, the dust, the failure, the persistent, bitter, metallic tang. That, at last, was the final, enduring truth. The general realized that the war never ended. It only changed. What it corroded. The metallic, recycled air, now clean, tasted permanently of dust. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.